All right, strap in everyone, because today we are going deep on the Japan-China Wars,
Yeah, conflicts that had a big impact, not just in East Asia.
but really around the world.
Absolutely.
I've got to say, you sent some fascinating sources over for this one. I'm
Yeah.
excited to unpack it all. So, we've got two major wars we're going to be looking at today. The First Sino-Japanese War, which kicked off in 1894,
Good.
and then the Second Sino-Japanese War, that spanned from 37 to 45.
A lot to cover.
It is, it is. But before we dive into the actual fighting, there's something I'm curious about that comes up a lot in these sources.
Okay.
It's this idea of Korea as a tributary state. Can you break that down a bit? What did that actually mean in practice?
Yeah, so for centuries, Korea had this relationship with China where they basically acknowledged China's kind of dominance in the region.
Okay.
It wasn't quite like being a colony, but they would send tributes, valuable goods, resources, to the Qing Dynasty.
Right.
And in return, they got a certain level of protection and recognition.
So almost like a delicate balancing act for Korea.
Yeah, you could say that. A
Yeah.
diplomatic dance trying to stay on everyone's good side.
Exactly. But it sounds like by the late 19th century, that dance floor got a lot more crowded. Japan, especially after the Meiji Restoration, is modernizing like crazy,
Totally.
and they're looking to expand their influence. And Korea, being right there geographically, becomes pretty key to that.
You got it.
So how did we go from all this diplomacy to, all-out war in 1894?
Well, you have both Japan and China wanting to control
Mm-hmm.
Korea, right?
Yeah.
There were economic interest, political maneuvering, you name it.
Mm.
But in 1894, things just boil over. Japan sends troops into Korea, and boom, that's the start of the First Sino-Japanese War.
Yeah, and looking at these accounts, something that jumps out at me is just how outmatched the Qing military seemed right from the start. Was it purely a technology gap, or was there more to it?
Well, technology was a huge factor. Japan had really gone all in on modernizing its navy. They adopted Western tactics, built up a powerful fleet.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, the Qing Navy, they were kind of stuck in the past.
Ouch.
And this difference became very clear in a battle that really was a turning point in the war, the Battle of the Yalu River.
Ah, yes, that's mentioned in a few of the sources. Seems like a pretty decisive moment.
Oh, it absolutely was. This naval clash happened in September 1894, and the outcome was just devastating for the Qing. Their Beiyang fleet, their main naval force,
Yeah.
it was essentially crippled by the Japanese. And from that point on, really the momentum was all with Japan.
Makes sense. So jumping ahead to the end of the war in 1895, we have the Treaty of Shimonoseki.
Right?
And from what I'm reading, it wasn't exactly a friendly agreement.
Not at all. The treaty was incredibly harsh on China. They lost territories. Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, even the Liaodong Peninsula for a time, plus a massive indemnity, basically a huge war fine. And on top of all that, they had to formally acknowledge Korea's independence.
Which, ironically, Japan ends up annexing a few years later.
Exactly. It was a major blow for China.
Yeah, talk about adding insult to injury. I can only imagine the resentment this must have caused within China. But thinking beyond that immediate impact, how did this loss shape China going forward? Did this kind of humiliating defeat push them to finally modernize?
That's where it gets really interesting. See, this defeat was a massive wake-up call for China. It exposed just how flawed their system was and showed them how desperately they needed to reform and modernize. Think about it.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about losing land, it was about losing face, losing their standing in the world.
Right, a real hit to their pride.
Exactly. And this humiliation really planted the seeds for big changes within China. It pushed them towards a path of drastic change in the decades that followed.
So while Japan's over there celebrating their rise as a major power, China's left trying to figure out how to avoid another disaster like this.
Yeah, it really set the stage for what was to come.
And it's almost like this first war set the stage for the even bigger conflict that's coming just a few decades later. But we'll save that discussion for the next part of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it. The First Sino-Japanese War, really, it was just the first act in this whole drama. The consequences of this conflict would echo for decades, paving the way for an even more devastating showdown between these two nations.
All right, so we've seen how the First Sino-Japanese War really shook things up.
Yeah, a real turning point.
Japan comes out as this rising power, and China's left dealing with well, the need to modernize, to catch up.
Definitely.
And now, as we move into the 1930s, the sources you sent paint this picture of, like, an even more tense situation developing.
Oh, absolutely.
Japan, now it's this full-on militaristic empire, right?
Right.
They've got their eyes on expanding their control in Asia.
Yeah.
And China, on the other hand, they're facing some pretty serious internal problems.
Yeah, the 1930s in China were just chaotic. You've got the country grappling with these two major forces fighting for power.
Yeah.
You had Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists.
Right.
And then, of course, Mao Zedong and the communists.
Right. So a nation divided against itself.
Exactly. And this internal struggle, it really made China vulnerable. Japan saw this as an opportunity.
And that brings us to what's often seen as the trigger for the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Marco Polo Bridge incident.
Right.
What's fascinating to me from these sources is how this seemingly small clash could escalate into this massive war.
It really shows you how even a tiny spark can ignite a huge fire.
Yeah.
So in July 1937, you have this altercation between Japanese and Chinese troops near the Marco Polo Bridge.
Just outside Beijing.
Right outside Beijing.
Yeah.
The exact details are still debated, but this incident, whether it was a misunderstanding or a deliberate provocation, it gave Japan the excuse they needed to launch a full-scale invasion.
So this incident was more like the final straw, really.
Yeah, the match that lit the fuse. Japan had been wanting to expand into China for years. They were hungry for resources,
Yeah.
coal, iron ore.
Yeah, to fuel their industries.
Exactly. The Marco Polo Bridge incident just gave them the excuse they'd been waiting for.
And what follows is a war that's even more brutal, even more destructive than the first. One of the sources you sent really dives into the Battle of Shanghai in 1937.
Oh, yeah.
Describes it as this bloody, strategically crucial fight.
It was a real turning point.
So what made this battle so significant?
Well, the Battle of Shanghai was just a slog. It went on for 3 months,
Wow.
from August to November of 37. And it was one of the largest, most costly battles of the entire war.
Yeah, the casualties were just horrific from what I read.
Absolutely. Japan wanted to capture Shanghai. It was China's largest city, a major economic hub. And the Chinese, they fought tooth and nail to defend it, but in the end, the Japanese were victorious.
And it seems like this battle marked a shift in Japan's strategy, their use of aerial bombardment, specifically targeting civilian areas. It felt like a real escalation.
You're right. The Battle of Shanghai was a turning point toward total war. The Japanese military, they started increasingly targeting civilians. They wanted to break the Chinese people's will to fight.
And that indiscriminate bombing, it really foreshadows what happens in Nanjing.
Yeah, the Nanjing Massacre.
I've read about it before, but the details in these sources are just horrifying.
It's one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century.
I mean, it's hard to even grasp the scale of the atrocities.
It really is. After the Japanese captured Nanjing, which was the capital of China at the time, in December of 37,
Yeah.
their troops just unleashed this wave of violence against the city's inhabitants. And it wasn't just soldiers they targeted. It was civilians, women, children.
It was just horrific.
Absolutely. It was systematic, sustained brutality on a scale that's almost impossible to imagine.
The sources talk about mass executions, widespread rape, just horrific acts of torture.
It was truly awful.
What really got to me were the accounts of, like, deliberate cruelty, almost like the Japanese soldiers were taking pleasure in inflicting pain.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate among historians about why the Nanjing Massacre happened. Was it a breakdown in discipline? Was it intentional? A strategy of terror? Whatever the reasons, the results were devastating. Estimates of the death toll range from 200,000 to 300,000. It's a dark reminder of what humans are capable of, especially in war.
A dark reminder, for sure. But despite facing this brutality, this military might, the Chinese people, they didn't give up. The sources you shared detail this fierce, multifaceted resistance movement that emerged.
Right. The Chinese people, both the nationalists and the communists, they put aside their differences and united against the Japanese. And they didn't just fight conventionally, they used guerrilla tactics, using their knowledge of the land to their advantage.
One source mentioned a group called the Red Spears.
Oh, yeah.
They used traditional weapons, spiritual beliefs.
It's almost like something out of a legend.
Yeah, it really is. So it wasn't just a resistance organized by the government.
Right.
It was everyday people taking up arms to defend their homes.
Absolutely. The Chinese resistance. It was this tapestry woven from all these different threads. And they weren't alone either. They got crucial support from international allies.
That's right. The sources mention aid coming from the United States and the Soviet Union.
Yeah, the U.S., they were getting worried about Japan's ambitions. So they gave China financial aid, military supplies. They even sent volunteer pilots to fight alongside the Chinese Air Force.
Wow.
The Soviets had their own reasons for getting involved. They were worried about Japan's influence in Manchuria, so they provided advisors, weapons, even troops.
So it becomes this complicated web of alliances in international politics.
Yeah, and eventually, of course, it gets pulled into the even bigger conflict, World War II.
Right. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 41 brings the U.S. fully into the war.
Right.
And the Second Sino-Japanese War becomes this key part of the global fight against the Axis powers.
It really shows how interconnected everything was. These wars weren't isolated incidents. They were all part of this larger historical tapestry shaped by global power dynamics, interconnected conflicts, and the consequences. They were felt everywhere, not just in China and Japan.
Yeah, the ripple effects were felt worldwide. And that's something we'll definitely explore more in the final part of our deep dive. We've been talking about a war within a war, right? The Second Sino-Japanese conflict becomes part of World War II.
Right, yeah.
But even with that global context, it's amazing how long this particular fight dragged on.
Yeah.
So what finally brought it to an end?
Well, it took a truly world-changing event. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Oh, right. In August 1945.
By the United States, Japan, facing complete devastation and the thought of fighting, against such overwhelming force, they surrendered unconditionally.
So the end of World War II also meant the end of this 8-year struggle between China and Japan.
Yeah.
But victory, I don't know, it feels kind of complicated here. What was the state of China in 1945?
Well, victory came at a huge cost. China was in ruins, cities destroyed, infrastructure gone, and millions dead.
Yeah.
Not just from the fighting, but famine, disease, too.
Yeah.
It's hard to overstate the suffering the Chinese people went through.
You mentioned earlier how the Second Sino-Japanese War, despite all the horrors, it actually kind of paved the way for a unified China under communist rule. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, tragic, but you're right. The war, it weakened Japan, of course, but it also destroyed what little stability China had.
Yeah.
The truce between the nationalists and the communists, it fell apart completely. By 1949, Mao Zedong's communist forces had won. They established the People's Republic of China.
So from the ashes of this conflict, a new China is born.
Exactly.
One that becomes, this major force on the world stage during the Cold War and beyond.
Absolutely.
And what about Japan? What happens to them after this defeat?
Japan went through a radical transformation.
Yeah.
Under Allied occupation led by the U.S.
Right.
They were demilitarized. Their constitution was completely rewritten.
Oh, wow.
Their entire political and social systems were overhauled. It was a forced rebirth.
One of the sources highlighted Japan's new constitution, calling it pacifist. I'll admit, I'm not totally sure what that means in practice. Does it mean they couldn't have any military at all?
No, it's a bit more nuanced than that.
Okay.
The new constitution basically said no more war. They renounced war as a way to settle international disputes, and they really limited their military capabilities. They were allowed a self-defense force to protect their own country, but not the kind of huge military they had before, the kind that could start wars.
Interesting.
This shift to pacifism was a huge change for Japan, especially after being so militaristic for so long.
So both China and Japan go through these massive changes because of this war, albeit in very different ways. But even though the fighting ended in 1945, I have to imagine the scars from this conflict, they haven't fully healed. How do you see the legacy of these wars impacting the relationship between China and Japan today?
That's a really important point. The weight of history is heavy. Issues like the Nanjing Massacre, the whole question of Japan's actions during the war, these are still major points of tension.
Right.
There's a lot of unresolved pain, a lot of mistrust.
It makes you realize history isn't just dates and battles. It's this ongoing conversation, right? One that shapes the world today and influences the future.
Absolutely. The impact of these wars, you can still feel them today.
Yeah.
Not just in government policies or international relations, but in the way people in both China and Japan think and feel.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've seen how ambition, modernization, and ultimately conflict completely changed East Asia. The Japan-China wars are a powerful reminder of how much conflict costs in human lives and the complex legacy that wars leave behind.
It's a complicated history, often tragic. But it's a history we need to understand.
Absolutely.
As we move forward, I think it's so important to wrestle with these tough questions. To acknowledge the past,
Yeah.
but also to look for ways to build a better future,
A more peaceful future.
a more cooperative future.
That's a great thought to leave our listeners with.
I think so.
The Japan-China wars, they might be part of the past,
Hmm.
but they still have so much to teach us about the world today
Absolutely.
and about the future. If this deep dive has piqued your interest, I encourage you to keep exploring. We've got a list of books, documentaries, even museums in the show notes,
Yeah, great resources.
where you can really delve into this fascinating, multifaceted history. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.